We're now joined by author and journalist Antony Lowenstein. Antony, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so we've got Antony on here to talk about his new podcast that he's done with us over at Dropsite News called The Palestine Laboratory, as Antony says it. I love it.
It's so normal for me. I mean, the way you say it sounds so strange to us.
I know, laboratory. Laboratory is how it's spelled. It should be laboratory.
It's much more lyrical, too.
It really is. So we can put up EX1 here. So you can find this. The first 3 episodes are now available anywhere you get podcasts. Just search Dropsite News or search the Palestine Laboratory in your podcast feed. The entire episode is available for paying subscribers over at dropsitenews.com. Antony, I guess let's start by rolling a little bit of the trailer so people can get a sense of kind of what this project is.
I told my brother, they are using a new thing. And I was right.
Despite the country's relatively small size, Israel is one of the world's largest weapon exporters.
One of the attractions of Israeli weapon systems is that they are proven in actual battle conditions.
So we are making all kinds of tactical robots, all of them been in combat situations in Israel, worldwide.
Pelleted future soldier technologies are proven and ready to use.
Choose the right munition for each target so it doesn't cause unnecessary damage.
An occupation that is testing weapons and killing people. They say it's been already tested on Gaza. And then market that.
We want to have this as a huge business, and this business relies on partnerships.
So, Antony, this podcast series is an updated version of your best-selling book called The Palestine Laboratory. Tell us about the kind of thesis of that book, how you came to write it.
So I've been working on this issue, Israel-Palestine, for about 20 years, but I was living in East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020, and I was noticing a lot of interesting reporting around Pegasus. Some viewers will remember that Israeli spyware that appears in countless countries around the world on people's phones that can essentially allows a country or intelligence service to access your information, everything, including if you have encrypted apps like Signal or WhatsApp. But what was so frustrating to me about this coverage was that it ignored the elephant in the room. Yes, it talked about the company that made it, NSO Group. Yes, it talked about what it was doing, but it somehow framed it as a rogue company doing terrible things instead of actually focusing on what it was and what it is, which is an arm of the Israeli state. It's a private company, yes, but it's used by Israel as almost a diplomatic weapon to make friends, essentially. So that sort of started me on a long journey. And although the Israeli weapons industry had been covered a little bit here and there globally, I wasn't the first one to talk about it. It seemed that there hadn't really been an extensive book about it. So I spent years researching it, spent a lot of time in Palestine, obviously elsewhere globally. The book came out in May last year, a few months before October 7. And the book did pretty well. And then October 7 happened and it's kind of exploded around the world. Now, the book itself, although there's an updated edition now, talks about October 7. I think for a lot of people and now with the podcast, it gives people, I think, a context to understand how we got to this point. The book and the podcast doesn't say that Israel is simply going into Gaza to test weapons. That's obviously nonsense, or Lebanon. It's not about that solely, but it's partly an incredibly important byproduct, which allows Israel to make billions of dollars every year. It's the 9th biggest weapons dealer in the world, and almost give it an insurance policy against criticism, because so many countries around the world for decades have bought some form of Israeli spyware or weapons or some kind of surveillance tech.
And what do we know about how intentional this is as a strategy and how open the Israeli government is about this being kind of an intentional and deliberate part of its military strategy?
At times it's very deliberate, at times it's incredibly secretive. So as I show in the book and we talk about in the podcast, we interview huge numbers of people, both looking at the historical aspect, but also the reality now, particularly post-October 7. There's huge amounts of declassified documents which we discuss, which shows that, for example, between apartheid South Africa and Israel back in the day, they were the best of friends. Publicly, it wasn't a secret that they were friends, but the depth of that friendship was not public. And both countries admired each other. It wasn't just a defense relationship, it was also an ideological alignment, an admiration for each other's countries, ethno-nationalism. At the same time, if you go to a lot of arms fairs globally now, since October 7, but before, you see Israeli companies, Israeli government promoting weapons that have been tested on Palestinians. Sometimes they use the language battle tested, often the videos, some of which were featured in that podcast clip that you just saw, but also available online, which show that the idea of using Palestinians as an occupied population to be tested on is somehow uncontroversial. Now, I would say it's morally abhorrent, but it's not necessarily hidden. So for some countries, it's seen as shameful and not discussed publicly, while other examples, since October 7 particularly, there's been a number of arms fairs globally, and we discuss those in the podcast and interview people, including some who have been there. And these companies are openly saying, we are testing robot dogs, we are testing killer drones, and they work, inverted commas. You should buy them, and many, many countries are keen.
I think Pegasus is a good window into this. And for people who haven't heard of this, it's a truly terrifying technology. It allows the person who has access to it, and access to it is quite controlled, and the U.S. takes an interest in who is able to get their hands on Pegasus or not. But basically, if you have access to Pegasus, you can do what's called kind of a no-click surveillance. So you can send a message. I could send a message to Emily, and she doesn't even have to do the dumb old person thing of click on it and put her password into it. Just the act of the message going into her iMessage or into her email and kind of unfurling, going from a Twitter link to a Twitter actual live link, a contact file opening up, that plants the virus onto your phone and gives you then control. There's been reporting that Saudi Arabia used it on Jamal Khashoggi, for instance. You talked about its value as a diplomatic tool. As I've talked to members of Congress about this tool, they're like, wait a minute, they can do what? I had no idea. So you have no idea. So we have no way of understanding, like,
Matt Gaetz hardest hit.
Because it's not just Israel that has access to it. Lots of countries now have access to Pegasus. But you can imagine that it's not a coincidence that it would be an Israeli company that came up with this. If you're occupying, millions of people, surveillance is key to that occupation. So can you talk a little bit about how the competitive advantage, so to speak, is produced by the fact that these Israeli companies have access to these occupied populations?
So Pegasus initially started about 15 or so years ago, and the founders of that company, NSO Group, came from Unit 8200, which essentially is the NSA of Israel, incredibly powerful, which often spies on America. And of course, America spies on Israel, which is an interesting, curious story that we don't hear much about. But nonetheless, that unit's almost a pipeline for people who come out of the military and then build and develop these weapons, these spywares, whatever it may be. And I think there is this, there was an article a few years ago in the New York Times which essentially said that spyware is the modern era's nuclear weapon, as significant as the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that description, but nonetheless, it is unbelievably destructive. And you have no idea, without quite complex testing, whether your phone has been compromised. So what does that mean practically? Well, I've interviewed lots of people over the years, journalists, dissidents, human rights workers in democracies and dictatorships. And as we discuss in the podcast, there is a trail of Netanyahu, particularly in the last 10 years, going to places like Rwanda, India, Saudi Arabia. He didn't visit there, but he's spoken to obviously Saudi leaders. And after those meetings, within 6 or 12 months, Pegasus is in use against those countries' so-called enemies. And because Israel, I think in many ways, for decades, but especially since October 7, is aware that growing numbers of countries oppose what they're doing, at least publicly, I would argue, and the evidence for this I think is pretty clear, that often these nations that are buying some of this tech vote in a certain way at the UN. Doesn't always work as neatly as that, but often it does. And in the last few years, when Biden came in, his people said they were outraged by Israeli spyware. They've in fact sanctioned NSO Group, the company behind Pegasus, amongst other Israeli spyware firms. But I'd say it's a pretty ineffective ban for a few reasons briefly. One, because there are countless other Israeli companies doing exactly the same thing. And secondly, I always saw this as a way to try to shut down or at least challenge the Israeli spyware business, which was challenging the American spyware business. In other words, Israel is 9th weapons dealer in the world. America's number 1. But in terms of spyware, Israel's number 1. And America's not happy about it, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is, in a way, I mean, it hasn't actually had much impact. NSO Group is definitely hobbled now, to be sure. It exists, and there's been some interesting reporting in the last few weeks that they're massively lobbying members of the Republican side in the hope if Trump wins that that ban would be reversed, essentially, if Trump gets in a couple of weeks. But again, even if NSO Group disappears tomorrow, the genie's out of the bottle. There are so many other companies doing the same thing. And that briefly, Ryan, that competitive advantage is that when Israel promotes these tools, they regularly say, both privately and publicly, this has worked in Palestine on Palestinians, or it's worked in India, or it's worked in Rwanda. That so-called competitive advantage is something that Israel trades on. And for many countries, that's really appealing.
So one big question I know gets a lot of focus in the podcast is what's changed since October 7th in this particular context? Like, what have we learned just since October 7th about how Israel is approaching all of this?
You know, on the face of it, after October 7, it would seem kind of insane that anyone would go to Israel for advice on intelligence or surveillance, considering the catastrophe from Israel's perspective on that day where everything didn't work. Intelligence failed, the military failed, the government was absent. I mean, everything was a disaster. And yet, remarkably quickly, really within a matter of weeks, many of the companies, some of whom had provided the so-called surveillance tech around Gaza, having spent a lot of time in Gaza, not since October 7, of course, but in the last 10 or 15 years, there's a huge suite of surveillance tech, cameras, walls, etc. All that failed. But many of those companies transitioned, pivoted very quickly. They're supporting what Israel's doing in Gaza. I'm talking about Elbit, Rafael, IAI, many others, testing weapons there. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these companies are now promoting those tools and weapons at arms fairs openly, not really a secret. And I think, although you'd think that the arms industry would suffer, because Israel's economy has taken a hit, it's at war, the war seems endless at the moment. But I'm actually pretty confident that that industry will continue to thrive, because after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, 2.5 years ago, many European countries came rushing to Israel begging for help to sell missile defense shields, and many countries were sold that, including Germany and others. Those sales haven't changed. Israeli spyware continues to be sold. The last figures we have came out a few months ago from 2023, which were $13.1 billion, the biggest arms record in Israel's history. I'm pretty confident this year is going to be just as high. And I think what Israel's doing now in some ways is increasing its reliance on the defense sector. We have a growing investment from Silicon Valley, particularly in the last years, and especially since October 7, that this growing nexus between Silicon Valley and the Israeli defense sector. Yes, some people in Silicon Valley are sympathetic to Israel. They might be pro-Israel. They might be Zionist. They might be Jewish, not all. But in some ways, it's more a sense that the industry is growing. It's thriving, that Israel is seen in some circles as winning, as succeeding. I mean, the fact that many of us who would see what's happening in Gaza as a moral and ethical catastrophe, mass slaughter, including now in Lebanon, that is neither here nor there for defense sector people who actually see money to be made. These companies are making a killing. And so that's what's changed is, in fact, the laboratory is accelerating. It's not slowing down. In fact, if anything, I'd say it's getting worse.
Well, Antony, thanks so much for joining us. Really encourage people to check out the podcast. Proud to have been able to host it over at DropSite. People can actually get a discount on it at dropsitenews.com/Palestine Lab. The entire podcast will be available in the next couple of weeks. But if you want to get it now, you can go to that URL, and I'll put it down in the the comments or the description as well. But Antony, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the support. It's been great to chat, and everyone should check it out. Thank you.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.